Ancillary Service Workshop, Ancillary Services Study Workshop. So I'm Julie Galden with staff. I have Chris Brown and Floyd Walker with me, and we're all part of the Market Analysis Division. About a month ago, we filed our draft study report, and at the time that we filed, we noted that we did not include staff's recommendations with the report. After posting the report, we posted questions on the draft report to help inform our recommendations, and we received 23 responses to the questions. We very much appreciate all the parties that filed comments, and we've read all the comments, and both those comments and the discussion at this workshop will be very informative for staff formulating our recommendations to the commissioners. So with the stage set of kind of the primary purpose of the workshop, let's talk about logistics and agenda. So the first thing I'll say is, apparently I was so excited about the workshop that I filed 3 copies of the identical document. So hopefully nobody was spending too much time trying to cipher the intentions. That was just a mistake, and I apologize. Let's see. There are 4 major topics, and we'll spend about 45 minutes on each of the major topics. We'll read each question and ask whoever wants to respond can come to the table and answer the questions. Please introduce yourself and speak into the microphone so that the recording and the room can hear. If you have the same answer as another entity, please try to send just one representative to provide the answer. And if you anticipate you'll provide an answer to the next question, you can stay up at the table, but we'll just try to be cognizant to make sure everybody that wants to come to the table can. We have ERCOT staff and IMM staff, and they've been key parts of the team for the study. They're going to have the chance to answer any questions that they want to as well, and to reply and provide clarifications. We'll probably take a quick 10-minute break in the middle. We are targeting to be done by 5 o'clock. And we're strongly encouraging that comments be limited to staff's questions. With that said, are there any questions on the agenda or the logistics? And Chris, Floyd, or Harika, is there anything you'd like to add?
No. Just make sure your name and the company who are you with repeated at every time, because people are watching online.
Thank you. The first question is relating to the appropriate criteria for procurement quantities of AS. And related to that, ERCOT filed a presentation about reserve levels that they'd like to briefly talk to kind of set the stage for this question.
So Jeff Billow with ERCOT. So as we went through the comments, we noticed that there were maybe some misconceptions about ancillary services. And so I thought maybe we'd kind of level set to make sure that we're all on the same page before getting too far into the workshop. So I think the first thing is there are kind of 2 situations that primarily are going to get you into emergency operations or load shed. So the first would be if you're simply out of capacity. So this would be extreme hot day, extremely cold day, and you have really high demand on your system, and you have all of your generation is committed, and you are you've run out of capacity. So that's the first situation. And I would say for that situation, that's not the primary purpose for buying ancillary services. That's not why we're getting the quantities of ancillary services that we need. So that brings me to the second scenario is a day where maybe you have plenty of capacity, but something bad has happened on the system. So that could be a load forecast miss, a wind forecast miss, solar forecast miss, or you have a number of generators that have tripped offline during that day. And usually it's some combination of like that. So a good example would be about a month ago, we had a day where a front was moving through the state and had stalled out. So we temperatures didn't drop as much as we had thought that they were forecasted to. So your load ended up being higher than what you were expecting, your wind ended up being lower, and you lost some generation that day. I think a coal plant tripped off. So that is really the day that we're buying the ancillary services to cover that, particularly non-spin and ECRS. And so I wanted to clarify that you know, as we think about ancillary services, what's the criteria that we should use for non-spin and ECRS? It's really on those days where we have enough capacity. It's not that we have run out of capacity, but we don't have the reserves online because the weather forecast, you know, indicated something, you know, a different condition than what we ended up having that day, or we had generators that tripped off. And so I want to make sure that as we talk about what's the appropriate criteria, it's really the criteria for those kinds of days. You know, that's what we're trying to you know, procure the ancillary services for. It's not as much the days where we just simply run out of capacity. You know, so for those days, I think that there are, you know, a couple reasons why we think that the watch is the appropriate criteria that we ought to be, you know, judging, you know, do we have enough ancillary services or not? And a couple reasons for that. So one is, I think the watch is most closely aligned with the policy direction that we felt we were given coming out of 2021 or during 2021. Because I think what we have seen is that since Winter Storm Uri, when we go into a watch, then that is sending maybe a false signal to the public that there's some sort of grid instability. And I think from a state perspective, I think the policy direction is we don't want to project that false sense of insecurity on the system. So I think that's the first point. I think that the second point, and this gets into what we filed, and I've got some hard copies if anybody wants to look at it, so we've used this analogy where it's the highway analogy where, you know, generally you're trying to stay between the yellow line and the white line. And you know, ultimately, you don't want to get into the ditch, which is, you know, in the analogy, that's your load shed. You know, ultimately, you don't want to do that, but, you know, there's still, between the white line, you've got a white line, you've got rumble strips, and then you've got, you know, a shoulder in the ditch. You don't drive on the shoulder to stay out of the ditch. You generally try to stay between the yellow dotted line and the white line. And so you have those other safety margins, but, you know, you don't generally drive in the ditch. And so where that, you know, kind of where that comes into the ancillary services, and what we're talking about here is prior to NPRs 1105 and 1106, you had, so between your EEA and your load shed, so load shed would be at, when we get to 1,500 megawatts reserves, EEA is at 2,500 megawatts of reserve. So that's 1,000 megawatts between your EEA and your load shed. But prior to NPRs 1105 and 1106, it wasn't just that 1,000 megawatts. You also had your ERS and your distribution voltage reduction. And that number can vary, but, you know, let's say generally that's about 1,600 megawatts. So from when you went into an EEA and when you had load shed, there's really, even though it looks like it's 1,000 megawatts, it really was about 2,600 megawatts. So you had that much in reserves between going into EEA, EA1, and when you got into EEA3 load shed. Now that we have moved that ERS and the DVR to happen after watch and before EEA1, now that difference between your rumble strips and your ditch, you know, that EA1 and the load shed, that now is 1,000 megawatts. So, you know, I think we saw some comments that, well, hey, you know, why don't you just compromise and, you know, instead of a watch or a load shed, why don't you do EEA1 as your criteria? I think we don't think that that's really appropriate because, that you're really in a worse position than you were in 2021 if you do that, because you're now really close to load shed if that's what your criteria is. So again, on those days when you have a forecast miss, do you really want to get that close? You only want to buy enough ancillary services to keep you out of EE1. We don't think that that's really appropriate. So anyway, I think that's what we're trying to communicate with that. Hopefully that was a helpful analogy. Again, so I think ERCOT's position on this is really we need to stay out of a watch. I think where the debate really should be is what's your probability of going into watch? Because I think that's going to really set your quantities. Should that be a 1 in 5 years, 1 in 10 years, 1 in 20 years? I think that's really where the debate's going to be on, how do you set your quantities? It's how often, so again, for those days like September 29th, where you had some kind of forecast miss, you had a unit that trip, on those days, how often do you want to not have enough reserves such that you go into a watch? Is it, again, 1 in 5, or, what's the criteria around that? So I think that kind of summarizes, and hopefully that kind of level sets on, why we're buying ancillary services, particularly non-spending ECRS.
Thank you, Jeff. I thought the rumble strip analogy and the diagram in the presentation was very helpful to explain the change in the EEA levels over the past recent years. All right. So with respect to the appropriate criteria for procurement quantities, we got comments from every commenter on that question. There was disagreement among commenters on the proper criteria. Some supported ERCOT's recommendation to continue the current operating posture implemented after Uri, while others recommended only targeting involuntary load shed as suggested by the IMM. So the question is, should the commission direct ERCOT to determine AS procurement amounts based on a criterion that corresponds to maintaining a specified level of reserves less than the amount used in current operating procedures and more than an amount that triggers a watch? And anyone who'd like to respond to that, please come on up to the table.
Anybody who wants to answer question 1?
Yes, question 1, thank you.
You can go first.
Do you want to start from that end or this end?
I haven't decided yet.
Okay.
Let me flip my coin. Okay, I'm going to start on this end.
Yeah. Okay. Michelle Richmond on behalf of Texas Competitive Power Advocates. I think, our position is that whatever posture is being used to operate the grid should be the standard that's used to determine your ancillary service procurement. What happens in the market should be reflective of what is happening in the control room. And so to the point that, better? Okay.
I think just kind of put it right in front of your mouth.
Okay. Is that better now? We want to make sure that what is happening in the control room is being reflected in the market, and at least the demand curves that are being contemplated based on the real-time co-optimization that has been adopted to date is pre-conservative operations and pre the changes that have been made since Uri, and therefore they do not reflect what's happening in the market. And so we think that that is a problem. If the determination from the commission is that ERCOT should operate the grid to avoid watches, then that should be what we use. I don't know that we've necessarily opined on which is the right one. We just want to make sure that whatever the commission directs ERCOT to do in that regard is also reflected there. Otherwise, there's a major policy disconnect between the decision that's being made and what the market is actually designed to provide in terms of the resources to meet that policy objective. And they need to be completely aligned and connected to one another. And so that's where we are.
Thank you.
Blake Holt, LCRA, completely in line with Michelle here. So I won't get into justification there, but one thing I'd like to add is that if there is a disconnect between ERCOT's current operational posture and the AS plan that is procured, ERCOT has directly told us that they will fill in the gap with RUC instructions. So in our mind, that's not acceptable. Resource adequacy is at the front of most of the stakeholder conversations today, and setting a policy that increases RUC commitments will no doubt put downward pressure on reliability. And it will do this by causing avoidable wear and tear to the aging ERCOT fleet. So just for context, there were 415 RUC hours issued this summer between June and September, and over 90% of those were issued to units that are 50 years or older. So we would prefer to create policies that allow these units to be used when they're actually needed, and this need should be signaled by and reflected in pricing and not through out-of-market actions. So in our view, in summary, the AS plan should be connected to ERCOT's current operational posture. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Brian Sams with Calpine. We see the objective of our market and its design is to achieve the reliability standard that the commission has recently adopted. And ancillary services are one of the dials that are used to achieve that standard. There are others like LMP and ERS. Prospectively, we might see something with DRS or with PCM, but we don't really know what those look like right now. And so when you all consider what the appropriate standard is, should it be a watch or EEA1, you need to think about it in context of, are you moving further from achieving the standard or closer to achieving the standard? And that's the thing that you need to be using to measure what that policy recommendation is. Right now, we don't see a lot of the, we know what the goalpost is, but we don't really see a lot of measurement. We see kind of each of these dials being tuned separately. So for example, with LMP, we've lowered the cap. We've lowered the duration for when the cap could be at the top. For ancillary services, we've recently reduced the quantities that we're planning on purchasing for 2026. So those are all kind of turning the dial down, sending less of an investment signal that would help us achieve the standard in the future. For ERS, there really hasn't been any kind of change in the last couple of years. We think there's a lot of potential for reform there that could bring more demand response into the market. And then DRS and PCM are both at zero right now because neither of those things really exist. So when you're thinking about changing the standard, you need to look at it in terms of the overarching goals for achieving our reliability standard. And that's kind of the main thing that Calpine wants us to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill Barnes, NRG, providing some additional perspective. Following Winter Storm Uri, ERCOT took action to operate the system more conservatively. At that time, while painful, we disagreed with that approach initially, mainly because of the timing of when that change occurred and the impact, particularly on the retail market. But admittedly, recognizing over time that we need to be able to operate the system and not be as dependent on severe scarcity events. So that is certainly the one thing that will lead to an outcome that we don't want, right? Our consumers want more reliable operations of the system. So we support ERCOT's approach on how they operate the system, the use of ancillary services, the goals that they accomplish, which is operating the system in a way where we're more conservative. We would just ask, and you'll hear this response in some of the other questions, is we have a stable amount of ancillary service procurement. Those amounts are known in some range. Large fluctuations in the procurements that are not noticed to market participants is disruptive. But obviously, reliability is at the forefront. Resource adequacy continues to be a concern, particularly with this large load growth that we are seeing in the next 5 years. In terms of identifying what tools we use for what reliability objective, it is good to have those defined. Ancillary services, DRS, do we expect that to contribute to resource adequacy? That is how you dictate the procurement amounts, right? So it's a really important decision that needs to be made at the commission. Are we going to utilize these tools in addition to operating reliability? And one of the concerns we have is as we eliminate those products potentially and say we're not going to use these for resource adequacy, then we get to a point when we're discussing the reliability standard, what tools do we have left? So that's a concern. What will we use to help assist with resource adequacy if we've defined ancillaries and DRS in a way where they aren't? So starting over and defining a whole new product at that time probably isn't the most efficient way to go. So that's a concern. And I just want to put a plug in our comments. We suggested a comprehensive review of demand response products, ERS in particular, that we could do a lot to create a whole new tool set for ERCOT, utilizing one of the biggest platforms for energy efficiency and demand response, which is the competitive retail market. We can design products for different customer classes, industrial, small C&I, and residential, that can help create a whole new set of tools for ERCOT to manage not only resource adequacy, but operational reliability as well. So we would offer that as a suggestion for discussion later. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Andy Nguyen with Constellation. I agree with all the commenters, TCPA and so forth, that have commented. I did want to add a little bit more on the concerns on RUC, which I agree with LCRA on. ERCOT having to rely on RUC for capacity shows a misalignment between ERCOT's desired operational reserve amount and the ability for the market to send the right of signals to commit that amount. What we see is that whenever ECRS was implemented and ERCOT started procuring that product, we did see a reduction in RUC. What concerns us is the comments that ERCOT made that if we do not have the right quantity or size of ancillary services procured, that they'll have to, again, resort back to utilizing RUC, which could be costly for consumers because of make-whole payments and also bad for generators for the comments that Elstree alluded to on the aging fleet and wear and tear. So really appreciate your time and consideration on that.
Thank you.
Lori, do you want to go?
Sorry, thanks. Take me out of order. I'm Laurie Block, and I'm here on behalf of the Texas Solar Power Association. In terms of the purpose of the ancillary services, we agree with ERCOT's statements today. They're an operational reliability tool for forecast errors and unit trips. That's not to say that ancillary services, along with other competitive market offerings, they all work together to achieve the reliability standard. But I think it's important when we talk about DRS, and I know we'll have a question on that later, when we're talking about resource adequacy, it's very important to preserve our energy-only market and the competitiveness of that market and reduce sort of the actions, the administrative actions that ERCOT takes in that market. And so when we're talking about the quantities of ancillary services or how they should be procured or what their purpose is, I do agree with a lot of the commenters that really defining what the true purpose of ancillary services is really just sort of the first question that we need to resolve before we can talk about the procurement quantities of them. But again, just in terms of conservative operations, of course, after Winter Storm Uri, ERCOT did engage in very conservative operations. That they have less than that, and so the issue is it a watch? Is it EEA? Is it load shed? Of course, in our comments, we stated that we'd prefer it not to be a watch, but we do understand that reliability is paramount. And of course, just really focusing on unintended consequences, investment signals, and keeping our competitive energy-only market. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ned Bonskowski with Vistra. We filed comments. I won't repeat all of those, and I'll try not to repeat what you've already heard from my colleagues here this afternoon. I agreed with a lot of what I've heard. I think perhaps where there is some disagreement is probably keying off of what Laura just laid out, which is, we agree that the primary purpose of ancillary services is for operational reliability needs. Where I think we start to diverge is, we have a resource adequacy standard that's been set, and there have already been decisions made to put a cap on the other tools that are there to support resource adequacy, and implicit in that decision is a need to use other tools, namely the energy and ancillary services markets, to help achieve that. And ancillary services overall, on average, are sending a signal for what that headroom is that you need. However, in order to have enough resources to meet those extreme events, you need some conservatism baked into that. To use the analogy that Jeff laid out of the road and the rumble strips, the market structure that we have currently only builds more road when you hit the rumble strips or go into the ditch. And so our comments are effectively saying we should have some additional room so that we don't hit the ditch if we have to hit the rumble strips. And keep in mind that real-time co-optimization is also going to be narrowing the lanes. So anytime you do get a crosswind that comes across, or some other swerving or obstacles in the road, there's going to be less additional capacity in the system, all else equal, to help address those. So just offer that to kind of extend the analogy and try to draw that together with the other comments. The only other comment that I have, and this is really more a question for staff, is in this question, should the commission direct ERCOT to determine ancillary service procurement quantities? Implicit in that is a commission direction, and so under the HB 1500 framework, that implies a rulemaking, and so I'm curious if that implies that we would be expecting a rulemaking on the back end of this project.
Wait for the report.
Okay. Thank you, Rika.
Thank you, Ned.
Katie Coleman with Texas Industrial Energy Consumers. So the way we were looking at this is when you're buying ancillary services, they're to cover off a certain risk. This discussion of total levels of reserves, we're trying to kind of marry that with what we think of as ancillary services traditionally, which is a little bit challenging. But normally you think of ancillary services as covering off a specific operational risk. And I think that you can get a pretty wide range of outcomes depending on what level of that risk you're covering off. If I think about how that ties into this discussion about reserve levels, our view is that we shouldn't be buying reserves to avoid using the reserves that we bought to cover off some specific risk. That you buy the reserves to cover off the risk, that's what they're there for. You don't buy a whole other level of reserves on top of them so you avoid getting to the ones that were purchased for that reason. But I don't necessarily know that means we want a less reliable system than what we're doing today. I think what it really means is we're wanting more objective analysis around what the risks are that we're covering off at what level. If you looked at our comments, I think the concern with using watch as the criteria is that it's a fairly subjective criteria. I think if you had a watch with pretty objective triggers, it may not get you to a materially different place than using load shed with a high probability of, or with a conservative amount of, trying to avoid that. So I think what we're really interested in is limiting discretion so that there's transparency for the market, defining what the risk is and what level we're covering off based on data that is transparent to everyone. So I'm not really answering the question because I think I think you can get to really any answer the way the question is formulated. The other thing I wanted to say is we actually agree with a lot of what has been said. Once you define what that risk is, we do prefer in-market solutions, including ancillary services, over using RUC. I did want to note, though, Ned mentioned, I disagree with Ned, that we don't put any money in the market until we're in the red here. And that's not really true. There have been other things that have been done to try to encourage self-commitment, to try to price reliability risk earlier, like all of the shifts we've done to the operating reserve demand curve. I suspect there'll be ongoing discussions about ancillary service demand curves and real-time co-optimization. And we believe that that whole suite of tools should be looked at under the reliability standard rule to decide, are we heading in the right direction? Are we going to meet our standards? And that's how that process will work going forward. There'll be an assessment that says, yes, we're going to meet it or we're not. And then the commission can look at all of those tools and decide what they want to use. We don't think one ancillary service should be used to meet that. So I think the takeaway is I don't have a specific number of reserves between a watch and load shed that we're targeting. I think the bigger thing is what are the risks we're covering and at what level, and let's spell that out clearly.
Thank you.
Hi, Eric Goff on behalf of the Texas Energy Buyers Alliance. I want to make a few points. One is the reliability standard that we've discussed already today and at length over the last few years is designed to avoid outages. And to the extent that there's a desire for the ancillary service procurement to line up with the reliability standard, we should keep in mind that the goal of the reliability standard is to avoid outages and not to avoid watches. Secondly, operating reserves consistently and transparently procured will, in the long run, become planning reserves. And so it's just so essential that people understand the quantities that are being purchased, why they're being purchased, and what uncertainties they're being procured for, because then when you procure them to cover those uncertainties consistently, you'll have enough generation to meet those uncertainties. And so we can get to the reliability standard not through, necessarily the need for additional money, although that might be necessary, but this through transparent procurement to meet clearly targeted goals. Thirdly, I just want to state we agree with what Bill said about how demand response can be a larger component of ancillary services, and I want to give a quick example of that. If some quantity of ancillary services and some products are being used to cover uncertain conditions such as forecast error or, a higher risk of generator outages or whatever kind of uncertainty, you don't necessarily need a 10-minute service to respond to something that you know hours in advance. But we don't have an hours in advance or days in advance demand response product that might be a lower overall cost to consumers if we did have it. So we really encourage the commission to consider demand response and new products in general and to cover the uncertainty that ERCOT is trying to do in order to get to the solution to meet that uncertainty for the least overall cost. Finally, and I hate to say it, but I think it's important, I think we really need to move past metaphors and analogies in this conversation. They're useful for understanding something as we're entering into a conversation, but when we get to the specifics of why we're doing it, it doesn't tell you, here's how much we need because of this metaphor analogy. We need to get to the specific reason that we're buying it, figure out what that risk is, measure it, and then figure out the least cost way to solve that reliability risk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, Cyrus Reed, Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club.
Sorry.
Oh, were you?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. If you'd like to go first, I've had a lot of coffee and a lot of candy, so.
I know, you should go.
Okay. Cyrus Reed, Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club. Wanted to answer the first question. We did file comments. First, we agree with a lot of what's been said today. I think I'm in agreement with folks right here that rucking is not the answer we want to see. It's expensive, it's inefficient, and frankly, from our perspective, can cause a lot of pollution as well if they're older, inefficient units. So I think we're in agreement there. ERCOT took a very conservative approach after Winter Storm Uri, and we understand why, and it's for the most part worked, but it has been rather expensive to consumers. It's a risk versus reward type of issue, but in our comments, we suggested EEA is a well-understood event, is clearer than a watch, and also, frankly, getting to the idea of demand response and agree that we should look at demand response as an additional tool. But even looking at the potential for growing demand response in the market, that period between a watch and an EEA is a period when things like residential demand response could be very helpful. So higher prices, we're already asking consumers, hey, can you turn things down? If we had programs in place, maybe there is a benefit to them financially because of they have a program with a rep. But if you bring in ancillary services too fast, they may not get that opportunity. So I think, it's not a we'll die if you go from watch to EA1, but it feels like a better option for the market and a good risk versus reward calculation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephanie Kroger with Hunt Energy Network. So we agree with a lot of the comments that have made, particularly agree with many of the comments that Ned made. I was struck by and wanted to highlight something that Jeff said in his initial comments. Completely agree that I think both the legislature and the Texas public has made it clear that we don't want to be operating in a situation where the public is concerned that we're running out of power through watches, through EEAs. And what Jeff mentioned was there's two ways that we get to that situation. The first one is that we're out of capacity because of an extreme event, extreme heat or cold. And I think his comment was that's not the primary purpose for ancillary service. But what I want to highlight is that is a critical issue that we must address. And to Ned's point, if we aren't going to address this through ancillary services, and as we move into RTC, and we see the energy and ancillary services markets becoming very efficient for the procurement, we are not addressing that issue. We need to address the resource adequacy component of this. When you look at where the reliability standard comes in, that first analysis isn't even started until 2026. And I would suggest that we don't want to wait until 2026 to think about what these tools are that are left in the toolkit. The one that's before us is DRRS. And I think what's clear from the ERCOT protocol conversations that have been happening is that market participants need some commission guidance on the purpose of DRRS. We would submit that needs to have a dual nature. It needs to address reliability reserves. It's in the name. It's inherent in the name. And that if we aren't going to be procuring ancillary services to meet that, then we need to address it through DRRS.
Thank you.
Rashmi Surendran, Shell Energy North America. So our position is kind of in between load position and the gen position, and we kind of agree with almost a lot of the arguments being made. Just wanted to come up and say some things that we can marry all of these together in that the energy and the ancillary service can provide the revenue stream needed to get the resources that we need if we quantify, qualify the type of reserves that we need and procure it through transparent competitive market. And so in that particular question about do we want to go between watch or the level of conservative operation that is needed, if I understand correctly, based on ERCOT's current filing and methodology. Their operation is currently to avoid watch. So I believe then we should continue that if that is the desire, and that definitely needs to be done through the competitive markets. And the important part is not to say one ancillary service is the driver for all of it. It is the combination of all of those, and to say that we, as the market, have as much transparency, so and have the ability to hedge and reflect it in the prices so that the forwards can reflect it and people can rely on it and use the forwards as investment signal to get the resources needed. So from all that perspective, it is not just the quantity, it is also how you value those quantity. So I wanted to raise the question about the ancillary service demand curve, and what we have right now is ancillary service that initially started getting, the reserves started getting procured through RUC, and with a lot of discussion at ERCOT got changed through AS, and that is getting valued. But with real-time optimization based on the current ASDC, that will have a significant impact. So we need to work on looking at what is the correct value of these services, what are the type of reserves that we need. And agree with a couple of comments made by Eric as well. It doesn't matter what is the type of resource that is providing it. What is important is we quantify and qualify what is the service that we need. And that includes not just like the megawatt that you get for the next 5 minutes. If you need a service for some duration for whatever reliability reason you need it to, that is for up to ERCOT to decide what is the service that we need, but that needs to be quantified and qualified so that the right signal gets sent out and the right type of resources get built to provide that service. And the way to price it is through the ASDC, and that needs to be evaluated.
Thank you. I think that's everybody on question one.
I just want
except-
to say something.
Yep.
Yes, IMM wants to repeat, because you didn't react to ERCOT's filing, or you don't have to, but.
I'll just say something.
Okay.
Jeff McDonald with Market Monitoring. So I just wanted to, we did submit comments. We may not have resubmitted comments addressing everybody else's comments.
Can you go a little closer to the microphone?
Is this better?
I think so.
Okay. So, but I would want to highlight one thing from our comments, given what I've heard from everyone here, and I think Katie said it best. The debate over whether or not to use a watch notification or any other type of notification may actually be a moot point. Our point was, in the comments we submitted, was we believe the procurement level should be set based on reliability criteria, and in that based on probability of loss of load. And when that's evaluated and the proper probability of loss of load is applied in that analysis in order to prescribe a level of procurement, you may find that the level of procurement is in the neighborhood of where you would procure if you were trying to avoid a watch. The discussion, and forgive me for being relatively new here, 6 months, I'm not familiar with all of the history, intimately familiar with it, but using, structuring operations around a watch notification isn't a reliability criteria. Structuring operations around the probability of lost load is, that's the intention of the reserves, and someone could come out and prescribe a new watch threshold or a pre-watch threshold, and those things would then become relevant in the quantity of procurement for AS, and that's not an efficient way to buy AS for an RTO. So again, I'll credit Katie for saying it best. Let's fall back to an empirical evaluation of the probability of lost load, calibrate AS procurement to that, and then see where that gets us, rather than trying to work around things that actually aren't even necessarily have gone through the public vetting process as far as a bar for AS procurement.
Can I ask something back to you?
Sure.
Regarding this example, falling into ditch, why it should be bad having some buffer before falling into the ditch? What's wrong with that, if the policymakers want?
I would like to say that I followed that example quite well, but I like Eric's comment, which is sometimes an analogy is taken too far. If I were to take that analogy farther, just for your,
Just for discussion purposes.
right, so we're driving in the middle of the road, right? We're always driving in the middle of the road. So I understand that when system conditions get tight, and as Jeff explained earlier, tight system conditions aren't why you procure reserves. You procure reserves for contingencies. So you're still always driving in the middle of the road. The road might narrow a little bit, but it's the contingency that gets you over to the, what was it called? What kind of strip? It's a rumble strip. Thank you. So why wouldn't basing your AS procurement on probability of lost load capture all of those conditions? It does. It captures all of those conditions. It captures the rumble strip. It captures the
Okay.
red load shed area.
So you're already further here. then.
So
That's different.
so it was hard for me to follow that analogy and see why we wouldn't constantly be driving in the middle of the road. The road may narrow, but we're in the middle of the road. That was probably an even worse analogy that you asked.
Thank you.
I think Jeff wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think I had a few thoughts listening to some of the comments. So I think that we do view the watch, we do view that as an objective reliability criteria. And the reason I say that is once you hit, in a watch, I should clarify, because I think Katie brought up a good point. There are several watches that we have. That could be related to weather or other reasons. I think when we say watch in this context, we're specifically talking about 3,000 PRC. So when PRC, physical responsive capability, hits 3,000 megawatts, that is when we enter a watch for low operating reserves. And so that's our objective criteria. And we do view that as a reliability criteria because at that point, you are starting to give up some of your other tools that you have. So ERS, as an example, it is not meant for days that you have forecast errors. ERS, and the operators would use it under those conditions if they had to, but that's a product that we have limited number of hours that we can use that each season. So that's really meant for those days when you are out of capacity. It's also at 3,000 that you start giving up your RRS. That's a good proxy for about when you would start to give up some of your responsive reserve, which is meant to arrest frequency following a large unit trip. And so that is where you are starting to take on, that's not your forecast error risk, that's where you're now taking on additional reliability risk for unit trips and those sorts of things. And so you're giving up some of that. So that's why we say we view that as really, that is an objective reliability criteria. A couple other things I just wanted to clarify. I think, ERCOT doesn't, we don't want to use RUC either. We would prefer that through ancillary services and the market, that resources would, commit sufficient capacity. So that's, so just to be clear, we don't view that as we like to RUC, it's we have to RUC sometimes. And similarly, I would say that we're very supportive of the ideas for demand response and figuring out how to get more demand response in the market. And then lastly, I wanted to clarify my comments earlier when I was talking about those days where you're just out of capacity. I'm not trying to equate that with the resource adequacy question. That's not. I think that there are some good points that stakeholders are bringing up here, but we're not viewing the quantities when we're talking about regulation or RRS or ECRS or non-spin, we're not viewing the quantities of those from that perspective. It's, the quantities that we're getting of those today is really based on the operational risks that we see. I totally understand. We have another question about DRS, and people want to debate that, and I think we're happy to participate in that, but I think in our minds that's a separate question from the, again, regulation, RS, ECRS, and non-spin.
Thank you. I think we probably should cut the first question because we've gone over time, and we'll go on to the second category and second question. Second category being the dynamic determination of AS quantities. Commenters on the draft AS study broadly agreed that dynamic procurement may be more efficient. However, there were concerns raised about how this may impact hedging practices for loads and generators. So question number 2 is, would the following procurement approach provide the appropriate balance amongst reliability, efficiency, and regulatory certainty to market participants? And the procurement approach is described as setting the minimum procurement quantities annually based on one criterion and setting the final quantities closer to real time, for example, 5 days ahead, based on some other more conservative criterion. So that's question 2, and I think we'll start on this side this time.
Sounds fair. So, Eric Goff, speaking again for the Texas Energy Buyers Alliance. Dynamic procurement is a good idea. However, if it's not done consistently and transparently, as I said earlier, then it will just be unnecessarily expensive and confusing for market participants of all stripes. So it needs to be based on a clearly established criteria that market participants can shadow and predict, and not based on anything that's potentially arbitrary. And so we shouldn't do it unless we can develop criteria that are transparent and that are forecastable. However, the specific methodology isn't necessarily a good one either. We shouldn't have a procurement that is, more conservative a few days in advance, because that's just consistently trying to guess whether or not we're going to have a particular condition and then procure more reserves. Instead, it should be based on what uncertainties weren't known during the annual process, but are known closer to the conditions. So if there is a particular set of conditions related to a higher likelihood of load, wind, or solar forecast error, or outage conditions, or a high number of outages where we couldn't stand to have more outages that weren't known on an annual basis, then it makes sense to procure those on a dynamic basis. But merely buying more as we get closer is just potentially more costly because it can potentially get in the way of longer-term procurement. Ancillary services are already a very illiquid market, and so introducing more complexity into how they're procured is risky. Lastly, another component of dynamic procurement could be which particular products are we buying? So back to my earlier point of you don't necessarily need to procure a 10-minute service if you know hours or days in advance that a condition might occur. So depending on the situation, you might buy a different service, and that all has to be part of that clearly defined, transparent procurement mechanism, or it will be expensive and unwieldy.
Thank you.
Katie Coleman for Texas Industrial Energy Consumers. And I think on this specific proposal, we think something like this could be workable if you give the market an expectation around kind of what the minimum amounts are going to be. And then I think what's contemplated is sort of what Eric is describing, which is whatever the factors are that require additional ancillary service needs in certain times of the year, you'll have a better idea of whether those factors are likely to occur closer to real time. My clients generally pay ancillary services as a direct pass-through. And so we typically don't have a lot of intermediate hedging from our reps against ancillary service costs. So from that perspective, our view is that any way we can be more efficient and have a more dynamic procurement that better tracks, the risk closer to real time, that's going to be better for my clients. I think the potential flip side of that, if you're thinking about customers at large, is small commercial and residential customers. And the issue there is that their retailers have to predict what their cost is going to be and price it in. I don't think that dynamic procurement is necessarily at odds with that, as long as it is something that, as Eric described, there are specific criteria, there's transparency, and it's consistent over time. That's no different than trying to figure out what you think energy prices are going to be and what your needs are going to be for your portfolio, right? So the issue is, to the extent that it's sort of an arbitrary determination that nobody can predict, that's the problem. But whether it's dynamic or more like what we have today, as long as it's predictable, that should facilitate pricing it into even small customers' contracts over time. But I do think that if you're trying to find a middle ground, giving a minimum quantity and then any additional quantities could be procured closer to, real time when you can assess the risk, that is a good starting point.
Thank you.
Ned Bonskowski with Vistra again. So I noticed, first of all, that the proposal to dynamically procure ancillary services is actually what we do today. There is a minimum ancillary service quantity methodology that ERCOT approves every year, and starting this year, the commission will approve that. And then when we get into closer to, say, a solar eclipse, ERCOT may procure additional ancillary services, or institution of conservative operations was another example that many market participants felt. So that already exists today, and it's not necessarily a new functionality. What I'm surmising is that the sense is, can that amount be changed? And, that's where, we have concerns that it may be perhaps a penny rich, pound foolish trade-off, where, we've already talked about the way that ancillary services can contribute to meeting the aggregate resource needs of the state. My colleague, Mr. Goff, I think you put it pretty well, said, if you have a consistent and transparent procurement of operating reserves, those can translate into planning reserves. They may not be all the planning reserves that you need for, for the entire reliability standard needs. How much you procure is going to influence that, but I don't think we disagree with that dynamic in general. But by trying to be overly efficient with how you procure them by putting more into the dynamic range, that sends a less predictable signal. While folks will try to adjust to that and make predictions, it's not going to be as predictable or as transparent as the status quo dynamic procurement is. And then on top of that, you layer on the scenario that Ms. Coleman to my left just walked through, which is, the retail electric providers are going to have to hedge it, and there's going to be different dynamics depending on different customer scenarios, but it's not necessarily a guaranteed, large cost savings, and it may just add a lot of confusion to the market in the process.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add.
Laurie Block, sorry, previous name, on behalf of the Texas Solar Power Association. We agree with a lot of what's been said. Can you hear me?
Well, I can. I just
Okay.
want to make sure that the recording picks you up.
Thank you. We agree with what a lot has been said, so I won't repeat that. Generators make investment decisions based on very clear, predictable, and transparent rules and market fundamentals. And injecting something that is hard to predict or hard to forecast will have an impact on that investment decision by generators, much like Ned just said. If the commission does decide they want to go in that direction, that's just very paramount, that it has to be very easily identifiable by generators, and load. And I would also say that this proposal, really, it comes down to what are the details? What are the ancillary services? Not all ancillary services might not need to have a dynamic procurement amount. Much like what Eric said, if you're buying a particular ancillary service to meet maybe forecast errors for maybe wind or solar, maybe that's very dependent on the weather. So that would be one class, and then you have regulation, and that would be different. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, but fundamentally, it just needs to be very clear and understandable if the commission wants to go in that direction.
Thank you.
Brian Sams, Calpine, 2 comments. If the idea is to reduce the overall procurement of ancillary services, it means less revenue in the market for generators, which has an impact on the ability to achieve the reliability standard. Big theme here. Got to measure it, and if we're moving further away, then maybe that's not a thing that we want to do. Second comment is around hedging. If you're creating incentives for option 1 or option 2 reps to not hedge, I don't want to be exposed as a retailer to other people's choices for potential uplift if things get tight and expensive later. So having the credit in place to ensure that you're able to cover off that risk is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Blake Holt, LCRA. Maybe something a little different that you hadn't heard from our written comments or what you've heard here today is the time in which we would be anticipating implementing this dynamic procurement is likely the time when we'd be starting to adjust to the go live of RTC. And so that's an already very complex undertaking for our market folks, and we're going to have to ask them to adjust to different hedging practices during this time period as well. That seems not ideal. I think also when you think about that, when RTC goes live, we'll be wanting to analyze the market outcomes, and having a stable plan during this time period would give us better perspective into what those outcomes are producing, and also have more confidence in incremental adjustments that we may need to make after go live. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill Barnes, NRG. We support the idea of moving to a dynamic procurement process. It's more efficient, gives ERCOT the ability to sharpen their pencil and adjust procurement amounts. Regarding hedgeability of this market, the energy market is already illiquid. It's difficult to hedge. Most liquid product is North Hub. You're going to be challenged to get any amount of size off in the market on that product. Ancillary services are even more difficult to hedge. So we don't see any material impact from moving from what's done today to a dynamic procurement that materially impacts hedgeability or liquidity. It's still going to be a challenge. What helps with that is a known range published in advance. So from a retail perspective that serves residential consumers, a stable procurement amount in a known range in advance. So you've heard some suggestions on posting minimums. That's great. We would prefer a minimum and a reasonable maximum amount. So we know if we see some type event coming, what ERCOT could procure up to. That allows the market to adjust, and we then make our own commercial decisions on how much we think we need to hedge up to. We think that would be a better way to go when adopting this approach, is minimum and maximum posted in December for the following year. Thanks.
Thank you.
Stephanie Kroger, Hunt Energy Network. Agree with a lot of the comments that have been here already. For developers and lenders, investors that are seeking regulatory certainty and clarity in terms of the revenues they can expect, it's challenging already. I think moving to the dynamic scheduling or the dynamic procurement increases that challenge. And while it's tempting to want to say if we make it predictable and transparent, that solves that problem. I think creating that predictability and transparency is going to be a lot more difficult than it seems at first blush. When you, and I solidly agree with the comment from the gentleman from LCRA, when you consider making those adjustments at the same time that the market is trying to incorporate RTC and understand what that really means, I really question is the potential for confusion in the market and lack of transparency worth the benefit at that time. I mean, maybe it's something that is studied further, but let's get through RTC first.
Thank you. I think we'll sweep back this way. I'll try to be consistent. Resmi?
Yeah. Rashmi Surendran, Shell Energy North America. We saw in the question about the minimum, so we feel that there needs to be a maximum as well if we go in the direction of dynamic, but we do have significant concern on the hedgeability side from the rep perspective, because hedging during extreme situation can be, like if the variability between the min and the maximum is large, then hedging that last extra amount during an extreme condition can break or make a rep, which is not ideally what we want. So if we are going in that direction, then we would recommend making the minimum at least covering 90% of the scenario, that is, so that there is not a large degree of variation. Ideally, as Eric and Katie said, if we can make it predictable, as transparent as possible, eventually we can get to that place where we will be comfortable and able to hedge like energy. But we need to get to that, and before we get, maybe the other question to ask is, if we do dynamic procurement, the quantities could be different between the high risk period and the low risk period, but during the low risk period, the value of the ancillary service is also very low. So from a cost perspective, it may not be that much different going into the dynamic procurement. So we need to look at what is that we are trying to get from it. And maybe what we need to do is, dynamic is a good thing, and we need to go there when we have a huge difference in that cost and we see a benefit in it. Another concern that we have is, right now the design for the RTC is to have a demand curve, and the quantity of the ancillary service vary hour by hour, but the total quantity of the ancillary service is, or the total quantity of reserves is based on the demand curve that is created. So are we saying that when you dynamically procure it, you are changing the demand curve as well for an hour by hour basis? If that is the case, it creates a lot of uncertainty on the energy prices and the ancillary service prices, and it creates more chaos. So we need to think about a lot of factors when we look into the dynamic. Dynamic definitely has value, but there are other factors that needs to be considered.
Thank you.
Can I ask really quick? I was going to try to get Bill on this, and then he ran off, but you brought the same point up on this posting a maximum value. I guess my question would be is that if we did a dynamic assessment, like a follow-up assessment, and that says that we should buy something above that maximum, then what?
So maybe that is the reason why you didn't put the maximum, and I can see, like, during an extreme situation, you want to be unlimited, like you don't know what is an extreme situation, and you want to have the ability to potentially buy it. So maybe the way to go it is to say, under normal situations, this is the min and the max, and during an extreme situation, there is another process that is used. And maybe that is some time when we use some of the things that is raised in TIC's filing, and what Eric was saying earlier, a longer duration demand response. So if you say there is an extreme, weather event coming, you procure more of those type of resources that have long lead time, demand response resources, and that could be additional reserves that you get, which is kind of different from the ancillary service. Could be that. There are many different ways you can adopt it, but I was saying from a maximum min perspective, to provide more certainty for the reps to hedge.
Right. No, I mean, I take the general point of the maximum. I guess I was just thinking of this fringe where like in real
Completely
time,
understand,
closer
yeah.
to real-time conditions, we realize, oh, we actually need a little bit more. Is that handcuffing us or limiting us in some way?
Yeah, and I think right now what we do is to say that we can buy additional, and there is also a 1,000 megawatt limit or something. So we could say this is the min and the max, and during extreme situation, there is a separate process that is some limit.
Let me jump Katie real quick. Bill Barnes, NRG. So our view of the maximum is a little bit different. We would prefer to have a maximum known and contained, right? So let's say ERCOT thinks that based on various scenarios, they need a minimum of 1,000 and a maximum of 1,500 megawatts for a certain product. That's the maximum. Like they can't show up and then say, oh, no, we need 3,000. Like that's the point of the predictability that you've heard is reasonable maximum is the word that I used, the phrase I used. Given their studies, right, they would obviously apply much more conservative criteria to defining the maximum amount, but we would prefer that you actually have those contained so that there is that predictability.
Wouldn't it help even if you didn't have that containment feature, if people are uncomfortable with it, rather than just having a minimum, at least to have, here's how we're going to calculate this, and based on that, here's what the potential maximum would be, just for situational. Yeah.
That would all be helpful, and even maybe a mid amount, which is under, 90% of the scenarios we see, it's going to be 1,200. Like, that would be helpful, and then let the market go out and hedge to what we feel the risk is.
And to address some of the question or concern that Bill raised, you could say this is the min-max for the ancillary service, but then you could have this long duration demand response procured, which is not an ancillary service right now. So it's not impacting that product, hedgeability of that product, but it's providing the reserves that ERCOT needs.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Mark Walker, I'm here for NG North America. And I'll start by agreeing with a couple of things on the resource side. Mr. Sams brought up the concern that reducing revenues in the ancillary service market it has an impact on investment decisions by investors. But I would add to and of course there are other issues I'll get into that sort of affect that on the flip side. But also operationally, knowing, your outage scheduling, your maintenance and fuel procurement, a lot of that, you're creating a lot of uncertainty with all of this complexity you're talking about. But the main point I want to make is more on the load side, and I'll start by quoting, the great Ned Bonskowski, penny rich, pound foolish. I think that is, and I want to get back a little more to the fundamentals of what are we really trying to achieve with this potential move? At any level, and I don't think it matters if we're going to kind of constrain it or add all this complexity that I'm not sure I completely followed at the other end of the table. But at the end of the day, as a retail provider, we have to provide, we have to hedge, we have to understand what our obligations are going to be, and it's not going to be short term. A lot of our procurement is over several months and several years. We have to hedge those things, and unlike Ms. Coleman's clients, we can't pass through those to our customers. We have to hedge all of those. And as we know, and if we don't, we get hit on those few days, it's a wipeout, and we know that. We've seen that, and we can't allow that as a responsible provider or on the behalf of our customers. So what does that mean? Well, I've got to hedge for all of this uncertainty, including all the stuff that's getting worked out on the other end of the table. That is only going to increase our costs for hedging, and you're creating a lot of uncertainty that is difficult to model, even once we've sorted out all these other things. But, oh, by the way, we have a lot of other things to get done. RTC and many other things we have to get done. Do we really need to be going down that path? Because at the end of the day, now we understand the logic, okay, ERCOT's buying less ancillary services. They're spending less money on ancillary services. Well, that's not the whole picture. If you're talking about a retail provider providing services to customers, we have to bear those costs to cover those risks and hedge those risks, and all those costs go into our products, because we, under the current regulatory environment, those aren't the kind of costs we're allowed to pass through generally. So at the end of the day, you may be saving, ERCOT may be saving money if you look at it just from that lens. But if you look at the market perspective, you're not. You're imposing a lot of risk premium, a lot of uncertainty, and at the end of the day, the customer loses. Thank you.
Thank you. ERCOT.
Why did everyone leave?
Jeff, would you like to respond on number 2?
Sure. Jeff Bill with ERCOT. So I think on the request for transparency and details, I think we hear that loud and clear, and totally agree that but before rolling this out, we need to provide lots of details and be very transparent with stakeholders, and so we're committed to that. I also wanted to note that, to Blake's point, our view is that this would be after RTC. So if RTC is December of 2025, I think the earliest that we would roll this out would be January of 2027. That's what we had, I think, presented. I think we put that in the report, but we at least mentioned or told that to our board when we were discussing this. As far as the min and max, I think that's a good idea, is providing that min and that max. I think that's something that we could work into the process. And I also agree with Eric Goff that I don't think that we would want different criteria for the annual and the dynamic. I think that we would really want to have, I think we want to send a consistent message on this is what the criteria is. And we're procuring to that, but maybe in the annual, we're calculating what that maximum is, what that worst case scenario is. But then in the annual, though, we're only going to buy maybe a percentage of that. And then as we get to the more daily procurement, that dynamic procurement, you're calculating what your risk variables, and you're determining what exactly do I need for this operating day.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to question 3 now. Same topic. Is dynamic procurement more appropriate for some AS or for some risks than for others? And this was touched on a little bit on the prior question, which is great. If so, which AS or which risks are best managed with a more dynamic procurement of AS? So anybody who wants to answer this one, please come on up. And we'll start on this side, which is you.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious that there's some ancillary services that are based on a known risk, like the largest contingency, that are going to vary less throughout the year as compared to something like non-spin or perhaps ECRS. So I don't think we have a strong view on this, but it seems like if you look at what the risks are that the ancillary services are trying to cover off, some of them vary a lot more day to day, and those seem to be the ones that would benefit the most from a more dynamic procurement approach.
That makes sense.
Ned Bonskowski, Vistra. I hadn't planned on commenting on this one specifically, but Katie, you do make a good point. There are certainly some ancillary services that have pretty hard constraints that, at the very least, you're not going to be able to have a lot of leeway on those. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on number 3?
Jeff Bill with ERCOT. So yeah, I think I agree with what Katie said. I think for particularly ECRS and non-spin, those are primarily going to be a function of what you think your risk of forecast error is. I think responsive reserve, that you could also do that dynamically because one of the main variables for that is inertia. I think we would have to come up with a methodology to determine what do I think my inertia is going to be, a day or two in advance. So that might be a little. I don't think that we're ready to do that right now, but that's something that I think we could potentially do.
And just to complete the picture, regulation What's the suitability with respect to regulation?
Yeah, I think regulation is also primarily a function of your what you think your forecast error and your variability is, and so I think you could set those dynamically.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to take a very quick break, 10-minute break. And we'll be back here at 3:02. Okay, let's get started again. The next topic is probabilistic modeling to determine AS quantities. Now, on this topic, this was, I think, the most agreed upon topic. We had broad agreement that a probabilistic modeling approach may be superior to a historical statistical approach. There was also agreement on the importance of carefully and transparently establishing modeling assumptions. So the first question is, how often should the commission review AS procurement criteria? So anyone that would like to answer that, please come on up.
Guess I'm the only one. Thanks, Bill. Safety in numbers.
Go ahead, please.
Ned Bonskowski, Vistra. So on this one, it seems like there's probably some interplay between questions 4 and 5 on the ancillary service methodology update process. I'll come right out and say that it's jumping ahead a little bit, but that seems to make some sense as a way to, if you're talking about the methodology for procuring the ancillary service quantities, if you're using a probabilistic framework, that seems like it should be part of it. And then with the recent changes so that the commission is reviewing and approving the ancillary service methodology on an annual basis, it all seems to marry up pretty neatly. So.
Thank you.
Bill Barnes, NRG, we were also supportive of the probabilistic approach. We would just request that ERCOT publish as much of the modeling inputs, assumptions, formula, criteria, anything that goes into that. We're a pretty big fan of the current annual AS process. Actually look forward to it. It's a good discussion. I'm a huge nerd, so that's part of the reason. But the system changes so much. Load growth, change in fuel mix, change in supply mix. An annual evaluation makes a lot of sense. The discussions we have in the stakeholder process are robust. We thoroughly vet the methodologies. We have good discussions. I would encourage the commission to also have that review on an annual basis because of the importance of the impact and the fact that things change so much that it's good to take a look on an annual basis. Thanks.
Thank you.
Rashmi Surendran, Shell Energy North America. From our perspective, we do agree that probabilistic has value, but we do feel that probabilistic creates a lot of, it can go in a lot of different directions depending on the assumptions. So on the question of how often this needs to be evaluated, it depends on what is the things that are going to be evaluated, how often, right? Because, for example, in the probabilistic study, if the evaluation is on whether we procure to just cover for loss of load versus some extra buffer, and if that question gets evaluated every year, that's really going to be disruptive for the market. But if it is about some effective load carrying capability of resources, that changes with the amount of resources that are coming into the system, so that makes sense to be evaluated every year. So so the answer to the question depends on what are the things that are going to be evaluated. And from that perspective, there are a lot of very fundamental questions that needs to be answered before we even go into the probabilistic one. What's our objective in getting the ancillary service? how are we creating the pricing signals? What are we valuing? Like, are we assume that all of the resources that are providing services right now, or all of the resources that are coming and being available, will we just assume that they will all be there? Or do we really, it is good that they are there, but we need to value it, and so we need to procure it and price it. Those kind of things will significantly determine what type of investments you will get from this. And so from thinking about all of that, what we feel is if we go into the probabilistic model, even though it has a lot of advantages, it will be very contentious if these kind of questions will get discussed a lot. So maybe a combination of two things might be better, like looking at a minimum quantity based on statistical and a maximum quantity based on probabilistic approach, because then you can look at what are the potential scenarios that can come, and you say, okay, I want to cover for all of the potential scenarios which have not happened before. And so statistical might not get me that. So a combination of those will get you the correct solution and not create the uncertainty that the market is worried about.
Thank you.
Jeff Billow with ERCOT. So I think, again, we hear the requests from stakeholders that they want details, they want transparencies. I think that I agree with the thought that this should be part of the annual AS methodology process. But I think because this is a change, it is our plan to start earlier, and we've actually already started on this model since there seems to be a lot of consensus that this is the direction we need to be going. So our plan is to bring something to stakeholders early next year so that we can start having those discussions, because we do think it'll take a few meetings to work out all those details.
Thank you. Well, that was an easy one. I'll take that. The last topic. Well, I guess we kind of combined 4 or 5. So is everybody happy with 4 and 5? Cool, awesome. All right, now moving on to, what is this? Just kidding. DRRS. How can DRRS capacity be best procured and utilized without distorting price formation?
I will have a different seat, Katie.
On this side, I think. I'm going to start on this side this time. Hopefully that's the opposite of what I did last time. I'm not getting at all tired, but if I was going to get tired, this would be the time of the day that I would. So.
I sat down here because I wanted to go last, but okay, I can do it this way. I just had a very sort of targeted comment to respond to something in the NRG comments about changing the duration requirement for DRRS from 4 hours to 12 hours during the winter time. We would disagree with that. I'm sorry, Mark Walker, on behalf of NG North America, apologies. First of all, the 4-hour standard is very clearly in the statute, and this was, as folks who may have been involved in that, that legislation like that kind of goes directions and it lands someplace, and that's where it landed. And there were, presumably reasons for that. Energy is correct. There is also a provision that says if ERCOT determines it needs a longer duration, then, they can move that direction. But to our knowledge, we have not heard of any analysis or studies that indicated that there's a concern about whether 4 hours would work. We understand there was, Energy has raised that there's a potential there, but we have not seen that. And if we were to go down that path, I think it would need careful consideration, analysis, studies, stakeholder input. I mean, in the order of, this is in the statute, and yeah, the statute lets you out of it, but we ought to honor what's in there and have a proper process if we're going to change it. And acknowledge that if you do make that move, even if just in the winter, you're going to eliminate a lot of resources that could be available for DRRS. And do we really want to take that away from ERCOT? Or are there other ways, if there are concerns about the 4-hour duration? Or are there other ways to manage it as opposed to extending the minimum duration period? And then finally, I think there was a sense that, landing on that 4 hours perhaps was a way to help incent developers of battery resources to take that extra investment for those longer duration batteries. And if you were to take that away in this process, then I think that's a disservice to ERCOT, a disservice to the market, and a little offensive maybe to the legislature. I think it's the last thing I'll say. I think someone reminded me in the Vistra comments. We're going to be looking at a lot of things in ancillary services as we go into real-time co-optimization, and that's probably a better place to talk about things like this than here, because as always, there's lots more to do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle Richmond, on behalf of TCPA. I think, first I guess I'll address some of what Mark just said. And I think DRRS was discussed, advocated, and designed to provide an incentive for dispatchable gas generation primarily. The 4 hours was a minimum. And I think that was to give some flexibility in case there was the need to do a greater amount of duration. I want to kind of step back a little bit, and from the standpoint of what we're looking at with ancillary services, with DRRS, with PCM, if it is implemented or not, is how do we achieve the reliability standard that has been set? And I think our concern is that we need to look at all of this from a very holistic standpoint. We need to look at every revenue stream that's available to generators in ERCOT and look at, do those revenues collectively provide what is needed to build resources, to maintain resources, and to ensure that we're not retiring resources that we still rely on. And we don't seem to be looking at it from that perspective. So when we look at the different tools, and there's a great debate about whether DRRS is for operational flexibility or if it's a resource adequacy tool, we keep taking things off the table. And the more we take off the table, it kind of leads me to the question of what is the resource adequacy tool? From a societal expectation and from I guess from a political expectation, we have an energy fund that is supposed to be providing about 8,800 megawatts, I guess, from the 16 projects in new gas generation. That's not a reliability tool. That's not market design. That is a loan that has to be paid back. And so we need to be looking at the different tools and dials that are available in market design to say, okay, if we expect these resources to be built over the next 2 to 5 years, what are we looking at in terms of revenue streams for them to pay back loans and maintain these resources, and what are we looking at from those revenue streams in terms of some smooth transition of exiting old resources and entering new resources? And right now, that seems to be lost in many of the discussions that we're having. And so I think we need to look at that. We see that DRRS is a potential tool to achieve the reliability standard. It is more than just an operational flexibility tool. And if you look back at the discussions that were had during the legislative session, and if you look at the advocacy that was done by those that were advocating in support of DRRS, much of it was sold to the legislature as an alternative to PCM, and as a resource adequacy tool. I think the legislature essentially gave you multiple tools, albeit, substantial guardrails, at least on one of them, that may or may not make the juice worth the squeeze in terms of whether it's a viable option. I think the other thing that we seem to forget is that investment is made by looking at forward markets. We're not making investments by looking in the rearview mirror and seeing what happened last year or what happened for a few months, or did we have 15 minutes of high prices or even 3 hours. And so we need to be looking at all of these and saying, what does this do? And what we have seen is that when there is a product that puts some revenue into the market that does send a price signal that says we should invest in these resources that we need, what typically happens is we have comments about inefficiency or concerns that there's this revenue in the market or concerns that it costs too much. And I think we need to remember that greater amount of reliability is going to cost more dollars. It's not free. And unfortunately, what's happened is we end up making policy decisions with the goal of reducing prices. How can we take that revenue out of the market? How can we make it cheaper for consumers? And what we typically see is that when those decisions happen, the forward markets drop. And that does not send an investment signal to build new generation. It doesn't send an investment signal that this market supports the resources needed for reliability. And so I think that is the concern we have, and we need to look at DRRS and ancillary services and energy and all of the tools from that perspective.
Thank you.
Bill Barnes, NRG. When it comes to DRRS, we recommend that, again, clearly define what the reliability objectives are. DRS could serve a resource adequacy purpose. We would recommend that that be clearly stated if that's the case. We know that one of the statutory objectives for DRS is to reduce RUC, which we're highly supportive of, having a competitive product to do that. And that's really what informed our view of how you could determine procurement amounts and how DRS is used, particularly in the different seasons. This goes to the winter proposal that we had, where you have some flavor of DRS that is used for longer duration events, because that's how RUC is used. When we look at times when ERCOT had a lot of RUC activity, they were RUCing on long duration assets that were operating for in some cases days. One, you could look at historical RUC procurements to inform how the procurement amounts for DRS. But in terms of duration, we do think it makes sense to have a flavor or a portion of DRS be allocated for longer duration resources, similar to how there are 3 different flavors for responsive reserve. Right? We have PFR component, we have FFR component, and we have one for load resources. You could allocate a portion of the DRS procurement amount, say 50%, for longer duration assets, 8 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours, and then maintain the minimum 4 amount for the other portion. Those are some of the ideas that we think would make sense to consider in terms of the design of the DRS product. Thanks.
Thank you.
Stephanie Kroger with Hunt Energy Network. I agree with much of what was just said by the last 2 speakers. And, in order to try and answer this question, we do have this threshold question that has to be answered first, which is, what is the purpose of DRRS? And as I've said, we believe that needs to be clearly defined, and it needs to be clearly defined to have a resource adequacy component. And in thinking about kind of the process for doing this, I go back to the language in the statute that is requiring this ancillary service report. And there's a portion of that which we don't feel has actually been addressed in the draft report so far, and that is the second piece of what's PURA 3504G 2, which is evaluate whether additional services are needed for reliability in the ERCOT power region while providing adequate incentives for dispatchable generation. We don't feel that that piece of the requirement in the statute has been fully addressed in the report so far. And so there's an opportunity for the commission here to answer that question and to address the purpose of DRS and in conjunction with that, how the requirements in PURA 39159B are going to be met, which requires the commission to direct ERCOT to procure ancillaries or reliability services that support and ensure reliability during extreme heat or extreme cold or times of high net load and low dispatch or low non-dispatchable generation. Given that, we believe that DRS should not be procured within the RTC construct, that it is a separate ancillary service. It's defined to be separate. It has a separate requirement in terms of when the units need to come online and the duration that they need to stay online. So I think it's really almost premature to try and address how price formation is impacted or not impacted until we really clearly define the purpose and the construct of DRS.
Thank you.
Laurie Block on behalf of TSPA. I'm not going to go over the legal sort of analysis that we provided in our comments. I'm sure y'all read that. But we do come at this from a different perspective than, for example, than Ned or Michelle. I think it's important to know that the IMM first introduced this concept for the need for an uncertainty product in their State of the Market report. And I do find it very interesting that in PURA, the legislature specifically used that term, that DRS should be for market uncertainty. I do agree with everyone that it's very important to reach the threshold question of what is the purpose of DRS, because it's impossible to talk about impacts on price formation and other things unless we address that. I definitely agree with that. Of course, we believe that it's an operational tool to address the market uncertainty, which was clearly stated in the IMM report when first discussing the need for this product. It was for things like unit trips and weather and load forecast errors. And that is consistent with ERCOT's statements today about the purpose of ancillary services. I do agree with Michelle that we all are invested in making sure that we can meet the resource adequacy and reliability needs of ERCOT. But there is a process for that, and that the Commission has laid out very clearly in their rulemaking adopting the reliability standard. And some of these arguments that we've heard were alluded to or directly addressed by comments in that rulemaking. And in the preamble to that rulemaking, the Commission specifically stated that they declined to sort of identify any market changes or specific products right now, should the reliability standard not be met. Rather, they wanted to have full discretion after ERCOT performs a comprehensive analysis to determine sort of how all of the products are working holistically together to meet that reliability standard. And then and only then would the Commission determine whether, and if so, what products would be needed to meet that gap. So I think this is a timing issue. We're really getting ahead of that Commission process that was clearly laid out in the preamble to the rulemaking adopting the reliability standard. I will just say that when the legislature wants to talk about a resource adequacy product, there is no ambiguity in the law. The section dealing with the PCM, it was very clear that that was a resource adequacy product. I think it is interesting that DRS was it a separate section? And I think it's, to Stephanie's point, I think it's also interesting that the legislature could have put DRS in the list of products or types of things that they were interested in meeting these sort of long duration winter events like dual fuel and on-site fuel and things like that. And since Winter Storm Uri, of course, we've created the firm fuel product, which has been very successful. So DRS wasn't put into that provision of the statute. They created a separate provision for DRS. And again, it wasn't with the resource adequacy section for PCM, it was different. And I think when the legislature does something intentional like that, it should mean something. And to Michelle's point about what are the incentives out there for generators? Again, we'll have a process to sort of look at that holistically, but the commission has been very active in trying to address this issue. We have made changes to the price adders to the ORDC as a bridge solution. We have spent months talking about the PCM. The commission has a very successful Texas Energy Fund program to bring in new generation. And I think all of these things are things that have occurred just over the last year or so to try to address that issue. So I'll just go back to my earlier comments. DRS is an ancillary service that's clear from the law. It should be treated like other ancillary services. And the best way to not affect our energy market for generators participating in that is to make sure we don't island something like DRS away from other generators, like without understanding the impact that's going to have on that market, just like all of the discussion that we had in the PCM. And I'll just close with, if we're going to treat DRS like a resource adequacy product like the PCM, where are the guardrails? And I'm sure Ned probably has an answer for that, but I'll let Ned follow up with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Ned Bonskowski with Vistra again, and I will try to be concise because I know a lot of us want to go trick-or-treating, and we're doing well on getting to that goal. So, all right, so first of all, thank you, Lori, for the segue, because I think I'll do my best to hit a lot of those points. So, first of all, I do want to say that, yeah, the PCM would be our preference for the resource adequacy tool. I think we said in our comments, it's only reluctantly that we come to the point where we have to be advocating that ancillary services are being used to meet that need. It's not our first choice, but it is a consequence of decisions that have been made, and that is at the behest of advocacy from lots of other stakeholders who, we respect the comments that they've made and the decisions that have been made, but that does lead us to a necessary course of action. And that is why we are actually talking about this and why we've been trying to raise this point. So, on DRS specifically, I do think this is the one where there is certainly the clearest tie to the reliability standard. And, Lori, to your point, the legislature could have put it in with the PCM, which is a reliability service, but instead they chose to put it in section 39-159, which is power region reliability and dispatchable generation. The DRS coalition, which proposed DRS, which is distinct from the uncertainty product that the IMM initially proposed. They said in the outset of their comments that introduced the DRS concept that it is the best tool, not my words, theirs, to meet the requirements of PURA 39-159B, which is the provision that requires the Commission to require ERCOT to establish requirements to meet the reliability needs of the power region. That is the section in PURA that the reliability standard rule in its preamble acknowledged it was meeting. So that's the connection between DRS and the reliability standard. That's how it was advocated. It was how it's structured in statute. To your point, yeah, the legislature could have put DRS somewhere else, but they chose to put it in the same section. So it was really added on as this is a requirement to help meet the broader goal of this section. And that's, I don't see how else to read that, frankly. So I'll leave that point there. The third item, and I think Michelle touched on this, the Texas Energy Fund, it can be a very helpful bridge to help spur investment as we, move into the next phase of the market's development. But the Texas Energy Fund is itself not a market design. And I've tried to make this, we've made this comment, I think last week. An analogy is like, we need teachers, right? Those are critical for the economy to function and to help kids develop the skills they need to provide a labor force that can help us all prosper. But we need, we can subsidize loans, student loans for those teachers, but they need to be able to make enough earnings to be able to have a good disposable income so they can live in the city where they work, and otherwise you will see teachers leaving the system, and that's something that I think lots of places around the country have struggled with, and I think there's a strong analogy to be made for how the Texas Energy Fund works relative to market design. Texas Energy Fund is subsidizing student loans in that analogy, but you still need to pay the teachers appropriately, and that's the market design piece. How do you design that compensation mechanism? Again, PCM is going to be the most directed way of the options that have been on the table. That's the most directed way to do that for the resources that you need to meet the reliability standard. However, as it's capped, and staff acknowledged this in making that recommended design parameter, that means that something else is needed to help get there. And so, the reason why we're having this discussion now and trying to bring this up ahead of the 2026 review timeframe is in part because of that Texas Energy Fund timing. The Texas Energy Fund can't wait until 2026. And so having some sense of what the market design looks like is something that every TEF applicant is keenly cognizant of, aware of, and trying to take into account. So I hope that's a helpful layout for why we think it's important to consider the dual nature of DRRS, and I agree with a lot of what Stephanie said. This will be really helpful for the commission to take up, and we really appreciate staff putting this question in the layout for this workshop, because it does help us to have this discussion, and hopefully, I think all stakeholders would really appreciate the commission's guidance on how DRRS should be utilized, and that'll help us all move forward on NPR 1235. I think we've had some really good discussions about what it was intended to do, how it can best be used, and I don't think there's any disagreement that is ultimately a commission decision. So thank you for including
Can
this.
I ask a follow-up? What did you mean TEF cannot wait for 2026
So
for the assessment?
Sure. So, TEF applicants are trying to move forward with their projects now, and all of the initial distributions from the TEF have to go out by the end of 2025. And so while we won't have the full analysis of ERCOT's analysis of the reliability standard, it will be very helpful to know what are the basic tools, what are the basic building blocks of the market design going forward. Because folks are looking to secure and invest a significant amount of capital in those projects. So that was the intent there. So, coming back to just what this question tees up, it's how can DRS capacity be procured and utilized without distorting price formation? On the procurement side of that question, the reliability standard is certainly one of the key components. The ancillary service demand curve that's used to procure DRS is also important. In the initial version of DRS that was put out, there was a flat demand curve, which basically meant that as soon as day-ahead prices hit $150, you would have gone from the full AS plan for DRS to zero. And I think there was some acknowledgement both by the IMM, and we agreed that you should have a sloped demand curve so that you are having some smooth pullback in how much you're actually procuring. We do intend to submit some comments soon to propose an alternative from the way it's designed from 150 to zero, because frankly, that results in a material change in the value associated with DRRS, and on the one hand, you want it to be able to provide enough of a price signal and still have some of that ancillary service at a higher end, and we think that should be flexible to what the natural gas prices are, so that way, if we end up in a period where, say, natural gas prices double, you don't, you're not in a situation where you're going to go short on valuable reserve service just by a function of gas prices. Second piece is we do think the demand curve should be extended out slightly from what the plan is, because otherwise, if you go to zero right at that ancillary service plan, you'll only procure that AS plan if it clears at $0. Otherwise, you immediately start going short. So kind of like with the PCM demand curve, where there was a little bit of an overshoot of the target, we think that you should include some amount of headroom so that you can actually have a non-zero price clear. Not to say that it has to be at what the demand curve is, but have some ability for competitive bids and offers to clear that. On the duration topic, this also feeds into that, and I do respectfully disagree with Mr. Walker from representing UNGI. The legislation did say that that ERCOT is delegated the authority to determine what the duration is. We do think that we do agree with NRG and with Hunt that some longer duration, especially in the winter, is appropriate, and agree with what Michelle Richmond laid out, which is, ultimately this was intended for dispatchable thermal generation, particularly gas generation. That is another lever for efficiently procuring it. On the utilization side, and I'm getting close to finishing, the reliability deployment price adder is an important tool to make sure that when it is released, it's not having the effect of bringing prices down when you're actually using a reliability service, and you are signaling that there's actually an additional need for that in the market. And then we also agree with the position that Stephanie laid out, which is, in order to decrease RUC, you do need to have some forward procurement and commitment of it. So it is the way it's structured currently to not be co-optimized in real time will help to meet that objective. And then while this isn't necessarily on the table today with the current NPR structure, if there is a future where there are either energy storage resources and or online resources providing DRRS, in order to prevent that same dynamic, we do also have to talk about offer floors for the release in real time. So that is all I have to say about that.
Thank you.
It's hard to know where to start. So we were one of the advocates for DRRS, and I think I'll start by clarifying what our position was on that and what our statements to the legislature and the commission were on that. It was a derivative of the IMM's uncertainty product, which is, and I think the statute reflects this when it talks about the criteria for buying it. It's to account for market uncertainty, including intermittency of non-dispatchable generation facilities and forced outage rates. It's very clearly meant to address basically intraday operational uncertainty. It is not meant to be what I think people say a resource adequacy tool. I think that really means a revenue sufficiency tool. And I don't think that the legislative history supports that interpretation. And I think that the commission's interpretation of what it means to be required to establish reliability requirements clearly rejected the idea that we're going to have a mandatory reserve margin with some kind of revenue sufficiency tool attached to it. Rather, the way I read the reliability standard and the role of DRRS in meeting that standard is that it does provide an additional revenue stream for dispatchable generation, and that stream, along with other available revenue streams in the market, should be designed to holistically form a picture that allows us to meet the reliability standard long-term. I think the idea of any particular service being a revenue sufficiency tool or any particular market feature being a revenue sufficiency tool has been repeatedly rejected. And so we don't want DRRS refashioned in that manner. In terms of distorting price formation, I am not sure that it is a given that DRRS will cause any distortions, and if it does, I'm not sure that they'll be in the direction of increasing or decreasing revenues for generators. And the reason for that is, one of the reasons DRRS is needed is because the market doesn't have great visibility into what may happen throughout the day that may require longer lead time resources to be committed. And that's one of the reasons we've been using RUC so much, is because there's this uncertainty out there. If we need these resources, we can't start them 30 minutes or an hour ahead of time. We really need to start them several hours ahead of time. And that is solving a visibility, predictability problem, but those units exist and they would commit at some price if they had perfect information, right, about what the market is going to do that day. And so at some level, procuring them through DRRS is actually holding them out of the market, which can have price increasing impacts. In some other instances, you're committing units potentially that may not have committed. So I don't know that it goes specifically in one direction or the other. I think it's meant to be a more in-market tool to replace RUC. So I think the question assumes there is some price formation distortion. I'm not sure we necessarily agree with that. We generally have been supportive of the ancillary service demand curve proposal from the IMM. I look forward to seeing what NED has, but I think we believe that that really is the right way to address this issue. And I think that's really... right. So a couple people have talked about whether DRRS should be co-optimized. I think the version of, if it's not co-optimized, that's going to produce inefficiencies that could, all things being equal, potentially raise prices because you're not efficiently allocating who's providing what in the real-time market, including DRRS resources. I think the version of DRRS that ERCOT has proposed right now doesn't include co-optimizing it. It also only includes offline resources. We're fine with that for an initial implementation, but I would observe that the statute does reference procuring it both day ahead and real time. We interpreted that as envisioning co-optimization at some level, and we also think that long-term there are some efficiencies to be gained by allowing some online resources to provide DRRS. We believe that that would allow generators in the market to better optimize the use of their portfolio. If they're already going to be committed that day, they could get some additional revenues from DRRS. And certainly in that scenario, it would make sense to allow co-optimization. But that, I think those are things that we could do in step 2 or 3 of the service. So we're not at a point where we think those should be taken off the table, but I think we're okay with not doing that for the initial implementation.
Thank you.
Eric Goff, on behalf of the Texas Energy Buyers Alliance. A few points. One point I made more thoroughly earlier, but is relevant here, so I'll make it briefly again, which is there's not a need to have a separate resource adequacy mechanism if you're buying the right operational reserves you need, because then you'll have the reserves you need to meet the operational conditions that you're expecting. And an attempt to have a separate stream of revenue that is somehow detached from operational needs is really not what ancillary service is for, and maybe also not necessary, because if you don't have sufficient revenue, then the problem is you are not sending the price signal from your operational reserve to the energy market about what reserves you need. And so that's a fix that's required to the way you procure the ancillary services for operational needs, what the energy price outcomes can be, and not a need to create a third, zombie revenue stream since today's Halloween. Secondly, I do have some concerns that I think can be addressed with foresight about pricing and DRRS. That is, it's possible that DRRS could lead to higher prices that are inefficient rather than prices that are efficient. And the way that could happen is if a generator that has market power were to identify that they could make money by withholding, but are not able to withhold because that's illegal, they could offer to sell DRRS for a low price in order to be required to not commit the generation. And that could have the same outcome as withholding. And so the demand curve, I think, is really critical to avoiding that. And I hope that we consider that as we develop it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I keep pushing this button. I don't need to push it. Cyrus Reed, Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club. I'd say we were loosely part of the coalition that was advocating for the DRS during the legislative session. I can understand the confusion, that there could be confusion in reading Section 39-159 because B talks about ancillary or reliability services. But the way we've been interpreting D and reading D is it's clearly an ancillary service. It's not meant to be, it may have reliability benefits, but it's not meant to be like a reliability service. It's meant to be an ancillary service to meet market uncertainties. The issue we've been bringing up that we believe is clearly part of the legislative discussion intent is that this is intended to be for resources that can meet these characteristics. And in our mind, that could include longer duration storage. It doesn't say generation resources, it says resources that are dispatchable and can meet these criteria. Don't have any problem if ERCOT determines that, especially in winter, they need more than 4 hours. That's perfectly reasonable for ERCOT to make that determination if that's what's needed. But, you know, we start with 4 hours. We do think that whether it's done now or in a second phase, having online resources, having co-optimization would be useful to the market and generally to consumers, and also including online resources, you know, frankly, may provide an incentive to both storage generation, but also traditional generation that is online versus just having older units that are offline that ultimately, you know, they may serve a purpose for now, but they're not going to be in the market long term. So it makes sense to include online resources as part of DRS, but it's okay if that happens in a second phase, if we need to get something started now.
Thank you.
Rashmi Surendran, Shell Energy North America. So we were part of the coalition that led the DRRS, and in our mind, there shouldn't be one ancillary service that is driving the resource adequacy. Energy and ancillary service all together should be providing the revenue stream and should have the ability to provide the revenue stream to get to the resources that is needed. And we agree with what Eric said earlier, that operational reserves can provide the long-term planning reserves. But we want to also caution something. To get to that, you also need to ensure that those reserves are valued appropriately. And so that's where we are in between the generation and the load sides. It's not that you buy a humongous amount of DRR service. In our mind, all ancillary service are operational reserves that needs to be determined based on ERCOT's analysis of what is the reliability need that it is trying to meet. So you procure those reserves. But that also means that if ERCOT wants to preserve that ancillary service, or that's a decision that ERCOT makes, and if ERCOT preserves that ancillary service and that causes the prices to go up, that is the value of the reserves then that is procured. It is not a distortion. yes, definitely, if you shed load, there is a value associated with shedding load, but if you want to preserve reserves, there is intrinsic value associated with preserving reserves, and that sends a signal for investing in that type of resources. And that is ERCOT decision to say what is the reliability benefit they are getting. And once you decide that, that determines the value of those reserves. So to ensure we get the operational reserves to planning reserves or whatever attraction we need to create, whatever incentives we need to create, we need to be very clear on the ancillary service demand curves. We need to be very clear on the quality of the services that we are procuring. So I want to stress on that one because we are going into real-time optimization, and that is being discussed and going to be implemented. And one of the things that is being discussed is like, for example, curtailed wind and solar providing ancillary service. And do we need to have this state of charge to provide the service? And so there are a lot of things that determine the quality of the product that you get. And once you define what you want, what is the service that you're procuring, you need to ensure that you're procuring the service that you really want and not diluting it for the short-term benefit. And once you do that, you create the value. Another point is, earlier we started discussing about dynamic procurement of ancillary service. That is another thing that probably could have an impact on the value of the ancillary service. Once we go into real-time optimization, ASDC is a fixed megawatt. So even if you reduce the quantity of the ancillary service, change it, it is theoretically good, but you are ending up procuring the same amount of net quantity. So why introduce these level of uncertainty into the ancillary service and create more disruption into the market? So those are some of the things that we need to think about when you want to use these services to attract the resources that you need.
Thank you.
Yes, Keith Collins, ERCOT. I just, a couple of comments here on DRS. We obviously have our stakeholder process looking at revision request 1235. We continue to listen to the various discussions from the stakeholders. A lot of that is represented here. We will continue that process going forward. And obviously, using the framework that was set out in HB 1500. And there was some discussions today about, for instance, real-time procurement. We recognize that that's an important element of that. And in the initial drafts, we did not have something that covered that, but we continue to think about how we might do that. We're also considering the comments around the duration. We do recognize that the 4 hours is sort of in one provision, and we do have an ability to reconsider that, but again, we don't take that lightly as well. And something for consideration as we continue to develop it. So this discussion is really helpful for us. We're thankful for this discussion, the discussion that continues in RR 1235 and our stakeholder process on that. And we definitely look forward to working to create a reserve and a robust reserve product out of that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Andrew Rammers, Potomac Economics. I'm a little unclear on what question was asked that everyone is answering, but I will respond to a few different points that were raised. I don't think I have anything unique to add to the comments about operational reliability versus resource adequacy, except to agree that it doesn't really make sense to procure an ancillary service today on the basis of creating revenue sufficiency for demand in the future, and that just conceptually doesn't make a lot of sense. I want to address some of the comments that were raised earlier about over-reliance on reliability unit commitment, and that we view DRS as being a well-suited product for reducing that reliance on reliability unit commitment. So I think there was some confusion about our comments in the initial study, suggesting that non-spin was not a appropriate product for procuring excess reserve capacity to avoid reliability unit commitment, but we think DRS could be designed in such a way that that would be a more appropriate product. As for price formation, we do think that the best way to avoid either excessively high prices or price suppression would be to co-optimize DRS in real time and to allow provision from online units. Co-optimization would manifest itself in higher prices if SCED were to start going short on DRS. And so from a price suppression standpoint, RTC could avoid that. And it would also avoid the situation where units are kept out of the market when it would be more efficient for them to commit if it can be provided by online units. And so that is more or less the summary of our comments here. We are involved in the stakeholder process, so if you want more detail on our position, you can find that at the Supply Analysis Working Group page.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to make sure IMM doesn't support more RAC, right? That was some of the comments we read.
Yes, I read those comments as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. ERCOT, more? Anything from? No? Okay. Wow. Very good timing.
Well, if no one else wants to add anything on number 6, I'll say thanks a lot for all the comments and discussion. It's been very helpful for myself, I'm sure for the rest of the staff. Harika, did you want to make a couple points to end?
Yeah, just some closing points.
You might, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and we really read all the comments and we listen to everybody, and our goal is really first comply with PURA and the scope of this one. But we are very aware of there are other related items going on. So we really want to do a comprehensive report, but first goal is comply with PURA. And if it didn't ask in the questions or in the workshop, Stephanie, it doesn't mean it will not be addressed in the report. So we want to provide a really holistic, a complete picture to the commissioners, and they can take it from there. And the other thing, I think somebody mentioned, maybe it was Cyrus, I don't know, like after staff files recommendation, there won't be any other comments period because of the timing. We just don't have time. It's going to be like any other rulemaking when we publish proposal for adoption, then it's at the end of commissioners, and that's why we are trying to give them 3 open meetings to discuss it. So the discussion may not stop after that, but that's the reason. And thank you very much. We really appreciate everything. Thank you. And thank you to you guys.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you all.